terms of the guardianship being handed over. If you look up in the right-hand corner, there are the founders' grandparents, maternal grandparents. Jean Moet, the Seigneur de Brouillet, and Perret l'Espagnol. Perret l'Espagnol had his grandmother had one brother whose name was Nicholas. Perret's brother, Nicholas, had a son whose name, surprisingly, was Nicholas. That would put that Nicholas down into the generation of De La Salle's mother. All right, and so that Nicholas is the nephew of his grandmother, which means, therefore, that Nicholas, the son of his grandmother's brother, is a first cousin of his mother. Right? And so that would make him a second cousin of De La Salle. And I'm pretty sure that's the Nicholas l'Espagnol who was, if it was his own uncle, Nicholas Moet, there was a Nicholas Moet who was his uncle, huh? But that would be Nicholas Moet, it would not be Nicholas l'Espagnol. I think that's accurate. Well, okay. We finally come to talk with some seriousness about our good friend Jean-Baptiste Blanc. Now, I've already remarked about Blanc when we talked about Saint-Sulpice, that Blanc was in Saint-Sulpice in 1693. He's a student at Saint-Sulpice when the founder is already well into the work of the schools and is at Vaugirard and all that sort of stuff. So he's a younger contemporary of Jean-Baptiste de La Salle, and a good friend of his bishop, who was bishop in Noyon, who brought him from Noyon to Rouen when he became Archbishop of Rouen in 1700 and we'll see a little later, 6, 8, something like that. So, now that you've read one whole book and part of another one, I guess you all did, in between other things over the weekend. So let me just point out to you some things that I'm sure you've already noticed about Blanc as a source. First of all, what literary genre would you put that pretends to be biography? But of course, the instrument of biography here, I would say, is much more rhetorical than factual. There's no question that he's writing this biography in order to help. He was asked to write a biography because they wanted the biography of the founder, but he really wanted the biography to serve the purpose of moving forward eventually the cause for canonization at Rome. And that's why he has a 4-volume biography. The first 3 are the biography proper, which we never had before into English until Brother Richard Hernandez made this translation. New Orleans Santa Fe brother. He used to be known as Bartholomew Edwin and was the Secretary General of the Institute at one time. So Hernandez's translation is the first time we've ever had these 3 books of the biography in English. The 4th book, which is called The Spirit and Virtues of De La Salle, he deals with the virtues of the spirit of De La Salle, following exactly the order of the questionnaire that has to be submitted to Rome when the cause first goes to the Roman authorities. And it's very important to know that in the process of canonization, once the process is opened on a diocesan level and is sent to Rome, the whole focus of the Roman investigation, apart from examining the writings for orthodoxy and so on, moves toward a declaration that this candidate has in effect practiced the virtues to a heroic degree. So just keep your eye out for how often Blanc uses that word heroic. It's not accidental at all. It's a technical term in Rome. I should mention, by the way, that there are 2 not only is the cause of Roland before the authorities in Rome at the present time, but so also is Father Barret, and that's moving along pretty well. And Father Barret's virtues have already been declared heroic. So also have those of Brother Exuperian, that tough old assistant who did a number on the American brothers, including telling several lies in the course of the discussion on the Latin question. But that's something else. So anyway, so this whole thing is put in terms. So the first characteristic of Bland that I'd like to mention is drama. Everything is high drama. He would have made a wonderful author of Western odors, because you got the black hats and the white hats. You've got the devil working against providence, and providence working against the devil. The devil. You've got nature fighting with grace all the time. You've got vice fighting with virtue. And you've always got a hero. And De La Salle, of course, is always the hero, and anybody else is a villain, even the good guys. So it's all very black and white. Although they're not wearing black and white hats, they might just as well be. Notice how often he uses the word perhaps. I noted on page 116, I think he uses it about 5 times. And then he also says no doubt, or we can be sure, or seem to be. And if you look for the weasel words, you'll realize all of a sudden how shaky the ground is on the factual basis for some of the things that he's doing. So speculation would be another important element. One of the things that must strike you very clearly is he's not the least bit reluctant to pass judgment. He knows what the devil is thinking. He knows what God is thinking. He knows what De La Salle is thinking. He knows who has pure motives and whose motives are less pure, and whose motives are, and who the people are. He knows everybody's motivation, inside and out. Another quality, lack of sequence. He can't keep the facts in straight order. He confuses one thing with another. He puts things before that should come after and things that come after before, and so on and so forth. He anticipates a great deal. Once he gets onto a story, he has got a couple of little facts in front of him or some notes or something, and he can't wait to tell the story even though it doesn't fit. So once he gets going on something, he kind of tends to pursue it all the way to the end, and it knocks the chronological sequence out of whack terribly. Gabe Healy was talking to me the other day about this business of the 14-year-olds in Paris, and I didn't realize exactly what he was talking about at first until when I reread it. I realized that when Bland is talking about that junior in Reims, then he brings them to Paris, but he's going to tell you that all over again when he gets into the contextual situation. So that's very, and then of course he's great for coming attractions in the mind of a movie serial, which we used to have in the old days. Will he do this? What is going to happen next? Will he be able to withstand the assaults of the devil? Etc., etc., etc. Trying to get you interested in reading some more. One of the things that you might not notice is we sometimes use the word commonplaces. Commonplaces is a literal translation for a Latin rhetorical device known as the loci communes. And these would be topics or themes with examples. And they were the stock and trade of every orator. And of course, Bland was, as a canon in Rouen, was especially, was one of his major assignments was to go around giving these orations on solemn occasions. So he was an orator in the classic sense. So therefore, he would have his stock and trade, he would just pull it out of his hat. He would have a treatise on humility and a treatise on providence and a treatise, and of course, coming out of Saint-Sulpice, needless to say, humility and obedience would be his stock and trade. So all he has to do, and when something like that comes up, is push a button. So you get the whole thing up, and he goes on and on and on and on, and he uses examples, and he uses them over and over and over again. We'll see that business of the absinthe, for example, twice. And look at the number of times he has them throwing mud and stones at the brothers. That probably is related to an incident that took place in Rouen that Bland knew about. But he has them throwing mud and stones at least 16 different times in 6 different times in Reims. So they're always throwing mud and stones, and humility and humiliation, all this other stuff. You get the impression that the brother could hardly walk through the street for crying out loud in this ridiculous-looking garb, which didn't look that. You get the idea. So, He's got classic defensive apologetic arguments for some of these themes. It's another part of the loci communes. So, for example, he has a big defense of the spiritual director. Big long thing on that. We'll point out some of these in context. He on this business of teaching the poor. And who are the poor? Well, we haven't seen much of that yet, but when he gets to Paris, well, he has a regular thing on that he goes over and over and over again all the time. He has a thing on the habit. He has the thing on the priesthood. He has the thing on the novitiate, and so on and so forth. So these themes, every time it's appropriate, he just gets into his oratorical mood and pulls this out of his head, more or less. He's got all memorized already, so we have to put it down. There's a lot of contradictions. And this is one reason where I suppose there's some disagreement between Brother Augustine and myself on some of these things. For example, about his spiritual direction. How docile was it? Well, he's docile, but then he goes shopping around till he gets the answer he wants. Or he left the brothers free to decide, but then he's got it all rigged in such a way so that they're going to decide the way he wants to decide. So there's a lot of that. He says De La Salle wore the habit all the time, but then in another place he says as soon as he wasn't teaching anymore, he put the habit aside. And then the business of the vows, for example, he gets very contradictory there, whether he for 3 years or 1 year or what. With regard to the founder, Bland's picture of the founder, there are two things that keep popping up here all the time. First of all, the word heroic, I've already mentioned that. But I think, and I'm inclined to think that this is true, because as the founder goes through all of his various trials and troubles, he's consistently stubborn and hard-hearted. He's got his mind made up, and he doesn't yield. And that could be either a positive or a negative character trait, and I'll leave it to Gus to do some more with that if he wants to. The other thing is that he smiles a lot. Every time something crazy happens, he just smiles at the person. Now, again, I think that you can say, well, wasn't he nice and affectionate and all that sort of stuff? But the smile can be sort of sardonic smile, too, as much as to say, well, foolish grin. So you can do what you want about the smile, but that's very often his reaction, just smiles. Once or twice he laughed out loud. That's more Gus's to me. Right. So those are some things. But, on the other hand, having said all that, I think we have to recognize that right at hand on his desk, Bland had these various memoirs, as they're called. And now, the founder wrote one, probably at the direction of his confessor, on the early origins of the Institute, the beginnings of the Institute. That has been lost. He wrote one on the habit, as we saw, we talked about sources, and that has been preserved. But the one on the beginnings, but Bland quotes from it liberally, and very often, up until the point where the memoir stops, we get the exact words of De La Salle himself, and it's always interesting to compare them, compare what De La Salle is saying about the origins with the way Bland is interpreting them. But in addition to the memoir from De La Salle, all the brothers were asked by Brother Bartholomew to write their reminiscence of the founder, much as we do when a brother dies, ask people who knew him to write up something about him and so on. And now, of course, in those necrological things that brothers write, nihil de mortuis nisi bonum type of a thing, you only speak good of the dead, and they're practically canonizable saints, some of them, and you say, is this the man I lived with? And so and of course, it's sometimes the memory is faulty and the facts are faulty, but there's no attempt whatsoever to be critical with regard to these things. And since the brothers, too, are hoping, well, this man was a saint, again, they're inclined to read back into certain things. So you have to be careful when he says, I have this memoir and I'm quoting it. We'll see one very clear example of that this morning, if we get to it. Sometimes they're helpful and sometimes they're not, but it does help to fill out the picture of the time. All right, so those are some things to notice. Now, especially, I'm sure most of you have noticed some of these yourselves, that I thought I would just kind of schematize it for you. All right? Now, okay, so if we're going to look at the foundation, notice the title that I've given it. all of this, it starts in Reims, of course, and it's over this 9-year period. And the word I'd like to emphasize in that heading up there is process. The foundation of the Institute was a process. So the traditional date is 1680, but as we've already indicated, not an awful lot happened then. Well, you could pick 1679 because that was the first school. 1680 is a nice round number. Got three circles in it. Maybe another one in the sixth, where 1679 is going to, well, anyway, 1679 is the first two schools. 1680, not much happened. When we were celebrating the tercentenary, I was going around giving talks. I used to say the only thing that happened, we are celebrating the 300th anniversary of the day when the brothers first learned to use a knife and fork, because that was probably the year when the founder brought the brothers into his home for meals. 1681, he had to move in with them, and 1682, he moved out with them to a new community. So the first community is 1682. Bland likes to call it the cradle of the Institute. And a couple of times he refers to the cradle almost became its tomb. He kind of liked that phrase, and so he uses that a couple of times. Never let a good line go to waste, you know. They don't get it the first time, try the second time. But when we come to the heroic vow in 1691, and the whole thing is falling apart, the three brothers make the heroic vow, and it is precisely a vow to found the Institute. So we could really, if we wanted to, have a tercentenary celebration this year. And but by the time we get to 1694, when they make the first perpetual vows, in a certain sense, that's when the thing is really solidified, by 12 of them committing themselves to perpetual vows for the first time. And so, in some senses, this is a process then that goes between 1679 and 1694, and you can pick any one of those dates depending on what's going on in your own life for the 300th anniversary. But it's interesting for us in a way that we are in the years 80. Most of us remember the 80s. We haven't got anybody here that's less than 10 years old. And so we lived through 1980 and 1979 and 1982, and now we're into 1991, and we're looking forward to 1994, etc. So we're sort of living in the same number of years as the founder, and that might be helpful to some of you. It might be helpful. Okay. All right, so that's the first thing to stress, is that this is a process. Now, actually, although most of this takes place in Reims, the real beginning is in Rouen, with the Rouen connection. And Father Barret, and I passed out a sheet today, put together by Maurice Hermans in 1986, because it was in 1686 that Barret, I think he died. Barret is in Rouen in 1659. All right? Now, Barret is working with these sisters who will eventually become the Sisters of Providence, with schools for poor girls in the general hospice. Right? And Barret and those works are supported by Madame Mayfair. Right? And it's so successful with the girls that Barret is trying to get Adrien Niel interested into doing things for boys. And of course, Niel comes to Reims, gets involved with De La Salle, who then is involved with Niel, and then all of a sudden you get De La Salle, and De La Salle alone comes out of that. No, I didn't want to do that. What just did I do with that? I had it so nicely designed here. Yeah, let's do it this way. So out of the Niel thing, we get Niel and De La Salle. And then finally, that comes into De La Salle. And that's the simple. So we have a sheet here all about Father Barret. He eventually goes down to Paris. By the time De La Salle has to face up to his own difficulties, Barré is out of Rouen and down in Paris. And Barré's great disappointment, the sisters thing was working well, but he was never able to get a group of men together in a stable enough community to guarantee gratuitous and charity schools for the boys, either in Rouen or in Paris. And so that was one of the reasons why he certainly gave the advice to De La Salle that he did. Notice, by the way, on the bottom of this sheet, so that we can get some more tension between Gus and myself here, at the very bottom of the sheet in the next to last paragraph, the community De La Salle would later write is at present founded on nothing else but Providence. And of course, that was the name of the sisters. Actually, the sheet is called At Paris, 31 May 1686. I distributed it last Friday. Oh, you didn't bring it with you. You're supposed to carry everything with you at all times. So it says, this at present would last for the entire lifetime of De La Salle, no matter how decisive they may have been during these early years. These directives of Father Barré do not warrant making of the religious minimum a true spiritual director of the canon of Rheims. Bernard and other biographers, furthermore, are quite explicit in this regard when they make, and with what authority, this director intervene in the transactions of renouncing his canon. A simple counselor, if you will, Father Barré is not less than one of those who helped John Baptist De La Salle recognizing the will of God. So again, it's that question of what exactly you mean by spiritual direction. He would go here and there for counsel, etc., etc. And as we'll see, one of the problems we have to deal with is this conflicting counsel that he was getting from some people and the role of a spiritual director in finally determining what it was he would do. Okay, so I passed that out Friday to be a little bit ahead of time, and I thought maybe we might be a little further along Friday than we got to be. Okay, so we have that business going on in Rouen, and it's out of that situation that Niel comes. Now for Madame Maillefer. Yeah, more people asked me things about Madame Maillefer over the weekend. Now, what did I do with Madame Maillefer? Suppose we take a look at some of that. Yves Boutet's masterwork, as a matter of fact, his doctoral dissertation, and his best all-inclusive work is entitled in French, The 17th Century Origins of the Brothers of the Christian Schools, and it's in 2 volumes. There's a big, long footnote on page 628 of the first volume on Madame Maillefer. Now, first of all, this is another struggle Gus and I have sometimes. In this account, in the French text of Blanc consistently calls her Madame de Maillefer, and you sometimes see that. When Hernandez is translating, he drops out the de, but it's there in the French, because he's trying to bring it up to date, because we know that she was not de Maillefer, she was simply Madame Maillefer. And that's always the tendency with people translating, to try to bring the translation up to kind of so make it more intelligible or more up to date. But then you destroy the source in a certain sense. It's also interesting that Blanc consistently calls the founder De La Salle, whereas within the original French text, it's always M. De La Salle. Now you can't very well translate that into English, Mr. De La Salle, because it wouldn't work. And the only equivalent would be father, again, so I think in there, in a certain sense, he does the right thing by simply saying De La Salle. Or maybe he could put M. De La Salle. Anyway, Madame Maillefer was not a de Maillefer. But Blanc is writing at a time when her son, their only son, had become a squire, and he was Monsieur de Maillefer. So he's tacking on to the mother a title that was in the family only afterwards with regard to the son, which is a first kind of a clue as to how reliable he is here. So that's on page 35. Now, she was of a wealthy family in Rheims. She was a distant cousin of the founder. If you think it's important, I could do the genealogy for you. The summary of it would be this. Madame Maillefer, born in 1623, died in 1693, so she was 70 when she died. She was born Jean Dubois. She married Ponce Maillefer, who died in 1681, who was a draper in Rouen. The aunt of Ponce Maillefer, Rose, married Simon de La Salle, the uncle of John Baptiste de La Salle. So her husband's aunt, right, was the founder's aunt, married to the founder's uncle. So the grandmother of Ponce Maillefer was Jean de La Salle, whose father Eustace de La Salle was the brother of Francois de La Salle, the great-grandfather of John Baptiste de La Salle. In other words, the great-grandfather of Ponce Maillefer and the great-grandfather of John Baptiste de La Salle were brothers. Now, figure that out if you want. As I say, I learned all this from canon law, that when you want to get relationships, you go back to the common ancestor. So you can see that the relationship was very distant and almost completely by marriage. Okay, so we go to page 36. She was born in Reims of a wealthy family. She married Ponce Maillefer, city controller of Rouen. That's not true. Her son was the city controller of Rouen. Ponce Maillefer was a draper. He was in the clothing business. Ha! So, she erected a statue to herself. Baloney, she had a mannequin, of course. Her husband was a draper, and she had first crack at some of the nice clothes, needless to say. And of course, Bland says at the end of that second paragraph on page 36, she went to church more often to show off and make display of her vanity before the eyes of high society, which likewise worshipped there, than to find admirers rather than to adore God. Well, now, come on. Bland, if you read carefully here, admits that there's an awful lot he doesn't know. He admits he doesn't know whether or not, if he was converted by his wife or if he had always been a good Christian. Well, there's no evidence that he was anything else but a good Christian. And then Bland says he doesn't know the date that the husband died. Well, we do know the date the husband died in 1681, which is significant. And then he says on page 40, their only son married a girl from Reims. Now, this is the son who becomes de Maillefer and the accountant and so on, and does not seem to have lived very long after his father's death. The father died in 1681. The son died 20 years later. Okay. Now, page 45, here's where we get to the heart of the matter. In the third full paragraph down on page 45. One day she mentioned to Mademoiselle de Monville that she would like to live near her, and the latter told her she would be delighted, as she hoped to profit by the virtuous example she would see. The humble Madame Maillefer was so upset by this gracious reply that rather than going to stay with Mademoiselle de Monville, she henceforth avoided her at all costs. Well, de Monville was the source for Bland, right? This is Bland's source. Now, Bland is writing this in 1732, at which time Madame de Monville was 85 years old. 44. Madame de Monville was 45 in 1693 when Madame Maillefer died. She was 25 when Madame Maillefer supported the school that was opened in Darnétal for Father Barret, and in this racy early life when Madame Maillefer was supposedly so worldly and all that sort of stuff, Bland's source was 10 years old. So he's relying on the memory of an 85-year-old woman, who probably head of her spiritual direction, who knew Maillefer. But again, in the genius of the time, making these enormous contrasts. There's no evidence that she was anything else, but she was always a pretty good Christian. She got to be known early on as the mother of the poor. That was her reputation, because And fundamentally, she spent a good bit of her own money, and after her husband's death, a good bit of the husband's money. Huh? Now, much of this, notice that Bland says that she couldn't get into all these austerities until the husband died. Huh? And he thinks that the husband died fairly well. The husband died in 1681. She dies 10 years later. Cloutier's comment is that if she was converted at all, it was converted to a life of discipline from a life of comfort, not from a life of evil. Now, the sheet. Now, of course, the interesting thing about the sheet is that when the beggar comes to the door, the Company of the Blessed Sacrament that had some control over the hospital where Adrien Niel was working had passed a regulation that made it a law that anyone was to report beggars and vagabonds to the hospital, to the central hospice. So that there was provision for them. So in order to get some kind of control over the homeless in this situation, the regular routine was if they presented themselves at the door like this, they were to be turned away. This was the regulation of the diocese, that they were to be sent to the hospital, which was only a couple of blocks away. If you go to Rouen, you can see that very clearly. You know where we know where the Maya Player House is. We know where the central hospice was. And of course, as far as the sheet is concerned, it's quite possible that either Maya, when they found the guy dead, he had been kept overnight there by the coachman. They found him dead the next morning. She either gave a sheet or somebody took a sheet to cover the body. Huh? They would have carried it away in a body bag. And so when they were finished with that, undoubtedly somebody laundered the sheet and washed it and folded it up and put it back. You don't have to presume any great miracle for this. So you'd better take all that stuff, but it's a great story, and he goes on endlessly about the contrast between virtue and vice, and pre-conversion and post-conversion, which is another one of the Lochi Kaludas. Huh? So that does it for Madame Maya there, I think. Yes?
It says she obtained workman's shoes, which had no soles to them.
Yeah. Now, how would he know that?
No, I don't know, but my problem was I can't picture shoes without soles.
Yeah, well,
It bothered me the whole
it's
weekend.
like... Well, I suppose the only thing you can imagine is that the soles had worn out or fell out, or that the maybe soles that were not intact, like Adlai Stevenson with a big hole in the middle of them, or something like that. But see, those are all examples, typical examples to show if a person goes whole hog for this business, they have to go all the way. And but that comes up a couple of times. He uses it twice, I think, doesn't he? 2 or 3 times. Your imagination is as good as mine as to how she could walk around with those shoes. But that's the old business too, of putting, when you have regular shoes, putting pebbles in them and so on and so forth, so that your feet wouldn't be comfortable. Anything else on Madame Maya?
Why does he portray her in this light?
It's rhetoric. It's just rhetoric. I think apparently there was some reputation that she moved over the course of her life. She got engaged with the poor, and she became increasingly pious and lived more simply, as we would say today, huh? And all of that sort of stuff. And here he's got this senile old lady who's reminiscing about this gal that you do, and between the two of them, their imaginations get working overtime. I think that's the best explanation, because he does the same thing all the time with the founder. You have to be that's what happens when with rhetoric, especially if you're trained in rhetoric as an orator, as a religious orator. So of course, you hear it even in churches today. God, sometimes it's the old thing that people who go to church are the ones who have to hear these sermons about the terrible things going on in our society and all this other stuff and so forth. And it has very little foundation in fact, but it's a good excuse for a diatribe. And when you get going, you just get worked up more and more. Does that satisfy you?
Well, I just don't really understand what you mean.
What?
I guess what you're saying is that this is the way to make an interesting story. It's not going to make her an interesting character.
Well, more than that. No, it makes it interesting for us in a way. But more than that, oh no, this had a religious. He's writing an edifying book to edify people. And so he's really using this to pass judgment on worldly women, of which there must have been a tremendous number of them in his time. I can just imagine Bland getting up in a cathedral and telling all of those fancily dressed women, the only reason you're here is your vanity to show off in front of all of these people, etc., etc. He must have been doing this all the time. Why, you're like Madame my affair, but she eventually saw the light. So, does that make sense?
The people that knew her would not recognize her in these pages. The way you're describing it, this is extremely clear.
Yeah, but by the time he's writing it, she's dead for 40 years. Yeah, sure, you know, that's the other thing, huh? They're frankly ready to canonize John F. Kennedy, you know, by looking back on those glorious Kennedy years until people began to find out the facts about him, which was another story. But no, yeah, you know, when people recede into the past like that, they become fair game for examples to use when you're into these preaching on these themes. Even our own image of the founder, of course, and so on and so forth. Now we get a very different picture of him when you begin to look at the facts. Huh? But he was always blown up. He came into the world a born Satan. Okay, we don't want to stay on my affair all day long. Frank?
A general sort of question, not just limited to my affair, but what bothers me a great deal is that since Blant is riddled with defects and also exaggeration, do you foresee that someday, as the life of the founder, Blant will be replaced by a document that we would be proud of?
Well, that's what we're trying to do. I was thinking of my own biography. Okay, so she sends Adrian Dale to Reims, all right? And he comes with this 14-year-old. Now this interests the hell out of me. This is the 5th time I've gone through this thing, and this is the first group. Well, it's practically unanimous. You're all interested in what's this business with the 14-year-old? Yeah. And that question never arose prior to this year. Isn't that interesting? You see how conditioned we are by historical circumstance. Never occurred to anybody over all of those years that there was anything the least suspicious about Adrian Niel coming to Reims with the 14-year-old. We know nothing about this kid or what became of him or anything. He may have been he probably formed part of that first group. He may have been one of those who left and went back to Rouen. He may have been one of the ones who stayed. I don't think we really know, do we, Gus?
No, there's nothing uncommon for a youngster to be teaching in school.
Yeah.
Some of the others actually came in at the age of 13 and 14, maybe after, because they're teaching 7-year-olds. No, and I was only 7 years older than Luke when I was teaching him.
And of course, the other thing is that let's not forget that Niel was the head of a group of volunteer laymen in Rouen who were willing to help him work with the schools, and some of them could have been very young. The only problem I have with that 14-year-old thing with regard to the custom of the time, which would be one answer, is that when the founder finally gets going and the 13 and 14-year-olds present themselves, he doesn't put them into class right away. He puts them in a separate category, and that was the first junior, which we'll come to. Okay, but here's Niel in Rouen, but he's already got this group of volunteer laymen trying to work. They were willing to work voluntarily and live in the hospice and try to conduct first schools for boys, but he never developed it into a stable community. So if you can imagine a 14-year-old kid, and he said, well, now who wants to volunteer to come to Reims with me and see if we can start something up there? It would be very natural for a 14-year-old kid. And remember, kids at the age of 14 would probably be a lot more mature at that time, too. Huh? Most of the kids went out to work at the age of 9 or 10. So, and they were pretty streetwise. So by the time you had a 14-year-old kid in that society, he probably knew more than his prayers. Okay, so, yes.
How old is
Niel, oh, that's another good question. Blant says he was 55. Huh? He was probably closer to 60. Because, again, he was 55 when the schools, he was 55 in 1673 or 74, when he got involved with Madame Mayfair at Darnétal, and Blain's going by that. So the probability is that he was about 60 years old. Yves Boutet thinks that he was, I've got that here someplace, I worked it out the other day. That's basically the story, right? He was born somewhere around 16, 20, 21. Right, so he was considerably older. He was, he was twice the founder's age. And we got to move. Okay, so Niel is involved with teachers in Rouen. He brings one of them with him, a very young one, comes to Reims, and now I'm not, my technique here is not to comment on everything, or not to go through this systematically. I am going to operate from here on in on the premise that you have all read this stuff, okay? So what I'd like to do is now simply take the text of Blain and point out some specific things that we might pay attention to here. Because I think the story is very familiar about meeting De La Salle, meeting Niel, the beginnings of the community, and so on. We'll straighten out the dates there a little bit. Now let's see if we can get a little bit along with that story. So here are a couple of things from Blain that I thought I would signal. And I would ask you to come now for the rest of this week. And if there are certain things that you have highlighted or that you're interested in. Now I picked up the Madame Mayfair and the 14-year-old boy from a conversation over drinks in the evening or of a similar time. But a couple of things to notice. On page 2, now, wait a minute, what's wrong here? Oh. No, sorry. That's premature. Wait. Page 51, we already did the Maya affair, all right, page 60 to 61. Notice on the bottom of the very bottom line at 60 and the top of 61. Blain has this in quote marks, all right, in the original French, and set off to some extent from the rest of the text. And you can be pretty sure that those paragraphs come from the memoir of De La Salle himself. Right? And of course, these quotations, you've seen them many, many times, they've been pulled, but you can be pretty sure that here's the founder's own way of expressing what was going on. It was by these two events. Now, it's interesting that in his memoir, the founder picks these two events, meeting Adrian Niel and the proposal by this lady, Madame de Croyer, the second school, the woman who had all the bucks and was getting ready to die and didn't trust Niel and brought the founder in. So it was the second school, really, that that's when he began to get interested. He's really not that interested with the first one. Meeting Niel, all right, that's the first one in a way. Yeah? But then the second one, that's when he began to get hooked. Prior to this, never gave them a thought. The suggestion had been made before. Roland's friends tried to get him involved, but never made any impression and never thought of carrying it out. And then that second one about his valet, his social attitude towards the teachers, and then that famous one about God guiding people very one step at a time. So that's a very precious quote from the founder. And even though that memoir has been lost, there's no question that that's fundamental. And it's from the founder himself. Page 66. Now, in Blain's account of this, he mixes things up pretty badly in terms of the dates, and it's a little difficult to reconstruct this. On page 66, in chapter 10, the second paragraph, he says, "At first, De La Salle did not bring the masters to live in his house. He limited them to inviting them to come for meals so he could begin to regulate their actions." So on. And if you look over on page 67, right at the very bottom, Meantime, the schoolmasters continued from Easter to the Feast of John the Baptist on June the 24th to live the type of regular life they had begun in his house. So now, what is confusing here is and it's a little, you can't be really sure, but Michel Sauvage thinks and uses, and I picked it up in the prologue to the biography, that probably it was Easter. And I like to dramatize a little bit of my own in that book with the prologue, that it might have been the result of some of his Lenten reflection. But it was probably Easter in 1680 that he invited the men to come to his house for meals. It was in December 79 that he hired a house for them next to his own. If you've got the map handy there, you can see this a little better than the one in the other thing. You see look at the top, St. Marguerite, his second home, that's where he lived, and right across the street is probably where he had the schoolmasters living. So he rented that house, but he rented it for a year and a half. That's one of the things that helps us get the date straight. So a year and a half would mean that the lease was up in 81. So they were living in that house across the street until 81. But prior to that, he brought them into his own home for their meals. In the beginning, he had the meals sent over to them to their house. But then he finally decided that it's time they learned how to eat them with a knife and fork, so he brought them in and set them down at his own table. And remember, the only people living in him at that time were his three brothers. They were the only people in the house. That great big house that they had that's described in the York. So that was probably Easter 1680 that they came in for meals. And that's the only thing he did in 1680 that was special. The two schools were already founded in 1679, and they didn't move in with them until 1681, so 1680, arbitrary. Okay. And then, in 1681, there's where he had to make the big decision. Now, the thing that helped him make that again was, again, another Easter experience, when Niel was away to Guise, trying to get that operation going, and it didn't fail, it didn't succeed at first. But while he was away, he brought them into his house during that kind of holiday time for a long retreat, and he was so impressed by what would happen there and what he could do with them if they were actually living with him all day long and so on, that it was probably that made him resolve not to renew the lease when it ran out on the 24th of June, which the Feast of John the Baptist, which was moving day, and all of the leases were geared towards that date. So it's undoubtedly in 1681 in June when they moved into his house for the first time. Right? And then it's a year later, on the same day, when he moves out of his house and puts his own house up for sale and moves in with them to the house on the Rue Neuve. And better get a look at where that is on the map there. The first community. Look at it, it's indicated down on the bottom on the right-hand side. First community, and follow the line up there. You'll see that's where the house is. Now notice the house, if you notice the way that black shading is there, there's a kind of a little slit there, and then the street comes along, and then it goes off like this. Well, eventually, this is where the house was, and this little gap between the houses is still there. If you go to read, and you can see it. And little by little, over the years, the founder kept buying more and more, or renting more, then buying more and more of these things. Now, he had living with him all these ecclesiastics, and so, but eventually, even before the founder died, the Institute owned this entire property, and we still have a school there on that very same site. That was what got me interested in this whole business in the beginning, to realize that the very foundation of the Institute was still in the brothers' hands in Reims, and I've visited now since then a couple of times. All right, so the dating and the sequence here is kind of important. All right, 68 and 69. In this conflict with the family, by the way, you have to be careful of the word parents all the time in French. Parent in French can mean parents, but it can also mean relatives. So of course, his parents are dead by this time. So sometimes you don't know how to translate it. So here he is involved with the relative. And that would have certainly been his sister and brother-in-law, for one. and some of the aunts and uncles and all the rest of it. So down at the bottom of 68, having prepared himself for this onslaught and having expected that De La Salle made use only of silence and patience, he let everyone say his piece and paid no attention, but went ahead with his plans. The next page, 69, the top. When people saw that De La Salle remained as firm as a rock in the midst of all the waves and cross currents and so, they finally let him alone. They washed their hands of him, saying that he was a stubborn man. Now watch out for that expression, because it's going to come up all the way through. In Marseille, for example, that was the accusation. And any number of times, because he knew what he wanted and he made up his mind. Once he made it up, that was it. Right? And then there's a question of, my affair says that after this crisis, all three of the younger brothers left the house. But we know now fairly for sure that Jean-Louis, the oldest of the three who were home, he had four brothers, but the oldest of the four had already gone to join the canons of Saint Augustine at the monastery of Genevieve in Paris. So this would be Jean-Louis probably stayed with the founder and was willing to get involved with the schoolmasters. Pierre, the one who eventually became a lawyer, he seems to have sided with the Maillefers, and Jean-Remy also, he's the one that they sent off to school, the one that finally wound up going crazy. So by the time De La Salle is involved in his own home with the school teachers, it's just De La Salle, the teachers, and his 17-year-old brother. So you have to be very careful about how you picture what's going on in that house. Okay, so in a certain sense, it already is a community. He's assuming charge more and more. Okay, so we've got the community established, and it's time to quit. And some people have other things to do very quickly and immediately. So we'll see you next time. We'll pick up from there. But make sure from now on you have the Blam with you. And as long as we're in Rheims,